Dos. ¿Y llega? Dos, tres. Dos. Dos, tres. Sí, dos, tres. Dos.
If they ask questions, I'll get it. I think so. Yes, that's fine.
Buenas tardes. A nombre del Tecnológico de Monterrey, reciban la más cordial bienvenida a Conferencia Magistral con Siri Hustvedt, evento que forma parte del programa cultural de la 30ª Feria Internacional del Libro Monterrey 2022. Para esta presentación, tenemos el honor de contar con la presencia de Siri Hustvedt y la participación de Genaro Lozano. A continuación, cedo la palabra a nuestros invitados.
Gracias.
Gracias por acompañarnos. ¿Se escucha ahí bien? ¿Sí está? Bueno, es un honor en la Feria Internacional del Libro de Monterrey. Gracias al TEC de Monterrey, a la doctora Consuelo Sáizar por este encuentro. Gracias a ustedes por acompañarnos. La conversación va a ser en inglés. Voy a cambiar a inglés para poder dialogar con nuestra escritora esta tarde, con Siri Hustvedt. Vamos a hablar sobre salud mental y la pandemia de COVID-19. Tienen por ahí, si alguien quiere, debe haber de estos traductores, si alguien lo necesita. Okay, we're switching to English right now. So thank you so much, Siri, for being with us this night in Monterrey in the Feria Internacional del Libro. I'm very glad to meet you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And I'm happy to be here.
Great. So first of all, I read a few interviews about you being in Monterrey for the first time, and I really want to hear your impressions because you guys don't know, but before we met a few minutes ago, and she was very excited about showing me a picture of Cerro de la Silla and the light of the city. So please tell me, how do you feel?
Yes, so the mountains are divine, and I think you're lucky to look out your windows or wherever you are looking and have the mountains not far away. Deeply impressive nature. The only other mountains I've seen that are sort of like them is in South Africa. Really, it's made a deep impression. And new colors, you know, colors are part of my experiences of Mexico, and this part of the country has its own colors. So those are my deepest impressions.
Well, you know, this city has changed a lot. Now it's a very progressive city. They have a same-sex marriage. They support equal rights, and it's changed a lot in the past few years. They also have a beautiful wildlife, bears around the city. Please help those bears. I needed to say this. We've been seeing a lot of killing of those bears in Mexico, so please protect those beautiful animals. So we're talking about not only Monterrey, of course, which I agree with you. It looks like Cape Town a little bit, and on the mountains. I was actually telling my husband a few minutes ago about it. But we're talking about mental health. And I was telling Siri that I really enjoyed, I'm pretty sure you already, you know this book that she wrote around 2008-9?
Yes.
The Shaking Woman, or A History of My Nerves. It's translated into Spanish. And I read it this week, and I couldn't help but thinking about how courageous and how well researched it is about this effort of Siri of opening up and talking about a problem she had. She was giving an homage to her late father, who was very sick, and suddenly she started shaking, and that became a book. The reasons why She was shaking. Tell me a little bit
Yes,
about it.
well, no one knew, right? So that was the exciting part of it. And for for quite a long time, I have been reading about neurology, partly because I'm also a person who has migraines, and I've had them since childhood. And I've had, auras, even once, a hallucination of two little pink creatures about the color of my shirt tonight on the floor, and I had no sense that it was a hallucination. That's my only one. But I've often had visual auras before migraine. And those experiences had led me into reading about neurology, reading case studies, and then also studying neuroscience. So by the time my shaking episode happened, I was deeply immersed in the material, and I thought it would be and it was fun writing it. Looking at my symptom that was mysterious. Nobody knew what to call it. And so the book is really an investigation of my own symptom through other disciplines, right? What would a psychiatrist say about this? What would a neuroscientist say? What would a psychoanalyst have to say? So I used my knowledge to explore what, in the end, is finally an ambiguous symptom.
And what I loved about the book is that you also do this research, and you talk about some people, some very famous writers such as Dostoevsky or Virginia Woolf, who had some problems, epilepsy in the case of Van Gogh or Dostoevsky, bipolar disorder in the case of Virginia Woolf. And I love how deep and how personal you get about talking about you are the shaking woman, you and the book.
Yes. So here it is, the big arc of the book. And I have to tell you, when I was writing it, I had no idea how it would end. I mean, what conclusion I would come to, because it's an investigation. But I understood after I had finished that the arc of the book is from this mysterious shaking thing that came over me as if it were some outside force, right? Some external, it's like the hand of God came and shook me up, Saul on the road to Damascus. And over the course of the book and writing about it, I came to understand that I needed to say exactly that. I needed to incorporate the symptom into the narrative of my own life, to embrace the shaking as part of me. And that in itself, I think, has a therapeutic function. I don't know about you. I mean, we talked about this before, because you've been very open about having epilepsy now for many years, which has, seizures, different from mine, but nevertheless a similar thing. And you've incorporated into, I think, the story of your own life.
By reading this, it reminded me of the time I spent at a hospital when I was a teenager. Also, doctors trying to find out what I had, because I had these epileptic seizures. At the beginning, they thought it was, in Mexico back in the 90s and 80s, they had pork, had this kind of insect, something warm.
Yes.
And so they thought it was that, and then they did some scans of my brain, and they found it was epilepsy, and I took a drug for 10 years and more than 10 years, which controlled my seizures. But I was completely scared, and I didn't have what you had, this intellectual curiosity to write about what was happening to me. I was 13 years old.
No, of course not. Yes.
But you did a great thing, and then we connected it to something that I read, Susan Sontag's Illness as a Metaphor.
Yes.
It's a beautiful book in which she talks about cancer, her experience with cancer. Then she completes a second book, and she talks about the history of AIDS. And also Audre Lorde and many other writers have written about some illnesses. In the case of Audre Lorde, also the cancer journals, no? So this book kind of reminded me that tradition of authors, of writers, women specifically, writing about these issues, how they live them, what moved them, what made them research about. And I think, would you agree that this is kind of also in that tradition of?
Yeah, I think, it's a very strange book because it's been called a memoir, and there are definitely parts of the book that are remembering, and I link it. I mean, it is interesting, right, that I had this huge shaking episode for the first time at a memorial for my father. There's clearly an emotional jolt that was happening that I was unconscious of. But I'd like to add, we were advertised here about the pandemic, but all illnesses, people talk about somatic illness, right? Which is supposedly, caused by something psychological. But of course, all illness, whether it's cancer or epilepsy or long COVID, has a psychic dimension, right? And the way a person regards his or her illness can affect the course of the illness, right? This is an important thing, I think, to understand, which is why I now think of that book, which I didn't at the time. I now think of that book as actually having had a therapeutic value for me. Because
catharsis?
not catharsis exactly, but I came to understand that important point that I had also understood with, chronic migraines before, which was that, we have, certainly in the United States, this idea that you combat disease, right? It's a war. We're fighting cancer, we're fighting this, we're fighting that. In fact, a warlike stance toward one's own illness is really counterproductive, right? I think you have to say, especially with chronic illness, I have it. And now I have to think about how the narrative of my own life is going to unfold with this disability or this illness or whatever it is. And that in itself, the incorporation of the illness into the self has, I think, very good effects. Now, we think we've just been through a horrifying thing, and there's a field that's interested me now for a couple of decades called psychoneuroimmunology. And this is how it started. It's a great little scientific story. There was a psychologist named Robert Ader who was doing behaviorist, rat experiments. And what they did was they had the rats drink sugar water that they like, it's sweet. But in the sugar water, there was an immunosuppressant drug, which meant that the rats got really bad stomach aches. So in good behaviorist fashion, the rats avoided the sugar water. Then they took the drug out of the sugar water, and the rats avoided it as they would. They didn't like it because they associated it with the stomach ache. They force-fed the rats just sugar water, and the rats died anyway. This is quite something, right? The rats were conditioned to be sick. And what Ader said was, well, that means that there's something in the nervous system that's affecting what's happening. But scientists at the time thought the nervous system and the immune system were completely separate. But he was a psychologist, and he didn't know that. Now they know that the nervous system and the immune system are sending signals to one another all the time. And this was, of course, very important in COVID. And they're, trying to study. It has a lot to do with immune responses. People who had dramatic responses to COVID had, very powerful immune responses.
Sure. I wanted to start with this book in order to connect it with the pandemic that we have, because first, because I find it really, as I said, courageous that somebody writes about his or her own mental issues. People usually are not used to talk about it, like they keep it to themselves. They don't talk openly about it, and there's like a certain stigma about it. So by reading first The Shaking Woman, I was really I felt empathy, and I also felt identified with what you were going through.
Right.
She just talked about neuropsychiatry, and her work is very interdisciplinary. It's literature, and it's also reading these neurojournals, etc. But let me connect it with what we're having now. The post-pandemic, we're still in the pandemic, but as we can see, nobody's using face masks anymore. We're not using face masks anymore.
Yeah.
Which is good. Gabriel Boric, the newest president of Chile, very recently he gave an interview in which he talked about his own mental health issues, problems. He was talking to a reporter in CNN, and he said, "Look, I have these problems, I have depression, I'm taking this pill. We need to talk more about this, especially after the pandemic." And you wrote a few articles and essays about living the pandemic in New York, and about how you call this a collective trauma.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit more about how you lived it? You talk about Zoom, you talk about being secluded, hibernating.
Yeah, I think that, New York was hit very hard in March of 2020. It was hit so hard, and I know people don't really want to think about this anymore, but, people were dying at a huge numbers. I mean, I remember the number in New York went up to 779 people a day. And all you could hear were sirens and the birds at my house in Brooklyn. And I think that there are lessons. In 1918, 50 million, that's the estimate, 50 million died from the flu pandemic. And there are 3 memorials in the world to that pandemic. 50 million people. And that's, a rough estimate. We're never going to know how many people died this time either. But why don't people want to remember? And why are we, we're in the midst of all kinds of political turmoil. And in the United States, people were blaming, the virus on China, and it became kind of racist issues. But I think it's that people they don't know how to be angry at a virus. Right? We can be angry at people because we give people all the qualities that they have, and that means that they can be the enemies. So shifting the viral problems onto scapegoats is an easier answer. I mean, I think that's part of the politics of this, right? Nobody can really be angry at a virus. It doesn't have feelings. It's not hateful. It's just part of the atmosphere.
But at the same time, you talked about not being angry at the virus, but being angry at politics, about the very anti-intellectual mood that started in the U.S. with the Trump administration.
Yes.
Distrusting vaccines, distrusting social distancing, which became a part of our language, just as viral, as you mentioned also. You write about having the symptoms without tests. The same day that Donald Trump was saying, go and get a test.
This is a funny thing. I mean, I have had COVID. I had it in May, the Omicron. But both my husband and I may have had it in March of 2020. I do a seminar for psychiatric residents at a hospital in New York, and I had been in the hospital, taught my class, and that was probably the hotbed of coronavirus at the time. So it's entirely possible that I had it then, not a horrible case, but I had all the symptoms and recovered. But but there were no tests. No. Much later, we all had them in our cupboards, the home tests, and we could keep checking ourselves. But, not to be grim, but we don't really know what the course of this virus is going to be yet. And we don't know, we know that great numbers of people now have some form of immunity to it, but we're not clear. But the amnesia interests me. Like you can tell, nobody really wants to talk about it if they're not immediately affected, right? Long COVID is something that people are living with, very mysterious, lots of research, but nobody really knows what's happening to those bodies.
How did you feel when you had what you thought it was COVID? Because I also had it, and I remember getting very depressed, very anxious. What it did to my mental health, it was really
well, I think there's fear, right? Because the fear is of the unknown. I mean, not knowing is probably one of the most anxiety creating features of human life. Now, to be fair, there's much that we don't know, right? We simply don't. But the way people live, right, is that we rely on a certain predictive reality, right? What we've experienced before, we throw into the future and we expect it to happen. That's what the future is. And when that predictable routine is completely disrupted, it is harrowing. Now, it's funny, I've been reading a lot of studies about this. It's both things. There were, in 2020, that time I was just talking about, a lot of people had anxiety, depression, very strong mental health symptoms, but many people, in fact, probably the majority, according to some of these studies, did really pretty well. And there was a lot of resilience. Not only that, there were people who found meaning in the experience. And if there's one thing they know, is that finding meaning in whatever is happening to you is good for your immune system, And weirdly enough, that all the self-help things, keep a positive attitude. Well, it turns out that real positive attitude actually is healing and activates immune systems. Just an advertisement for writing. They also know that 20 minutes of emotionally driven writing, say in a journal, is good for your liver, your respiration, your mood, and your immune system. I mean, here you are, I know you're all readers, but writing can have really good effects too. And of course, there are people who are isolated and for the first time had to think about the meaning of their existence, especially if it was disrupted.
Sure. I wanted to say more about this because you also write about how the pandemic differentiated between social classes. The rich went away from the city to their home countries. Some people had the privilege of being able to work at home, but also many people had to go out and work outside, still with the pandemic, right? And how this, in a way, showed this social difference and class difference in the U.S.
Yes.
Do you think we learned anything from it?
Well, I hope so. The fact is the pandemic made it much harder, I think, for people to buy into this idea that, you're just born that way. It's in your genes. Because in the United States, the inequalities were enormous. The difference in, class and, in my country, racial differences had a huge effect on outcomes. And again, a little, science-y stuff, they're starting to do research on people who live with racism day in and day out. and the effects that has on gene expression, how the genes are expressed through the immune system to create chronic inflammation, which is a very bad thing to walk around with. So that connection, I think, is really important, that we don't lift the patient, whether it's you or me, with, I'm assuming, middle class roots, from where the person is and the people around them. Because social support, what they call social support, and I like to call love, if you're well loved and you have people in your orbit and your circle, it improves your health enormously, right? And again, they've done studies, something so small as the stress of taking an exam lowers the immune system so that medical students get colds more easily, right? It's fascinating. So we can't look at a patient as a machine that can be broken down and put back together. We have to start thinking about a patient and where that person is, what are the support systems that person has, because it affects the illness itself, and I think every illness.
Let me go more into and ask you a question. You talk about collective trauma. It's an era of collective trauma because of COVID. Wouldn't you say also it's also an era of collective guilt? Are we guilt as charged for this pandemic, for the mistreatment of animals?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting that, we don't know what's ahead, right? We can't read the future, but I think there is a very strong argument that this pandemic has to do with the lack of biodiversity the ecological lack of diversity, which has brought animals and humans in closer proximity, which makes the leap of the virus from an animal to a human more likely. There's been lots of debates about this, but I think it's definitely swinging to that belief or that position in science. And we need to do what we can. So the guilt, guilt is an important emotion if it spurs action, right? Guilt can be good. Anger can be good if it gets you to do something about it. Depression usually doesn't help anything, right? Depression is, sickness behavior. People lie down, and that too may be related to immune responses, by the way, but that doesn't spur action.
And I was asking that because a lot of people who work a lot of activists, vegan activists, are calling and telling the world, please listen to scientists, stop eating animals. We need to change this. The pandemic was also produced because of our exploitation of animals, which I agree. So I wanted to hear you on that.
Yes, good.
One of my favorite Italian authors, Paolo Giordano, I don't know if you've read him.
Yes, one thing.
He wrote one of the first books about the pandemic. It's called Nel Contagio, in the contagion, or something like that into English.
Yes.
He writes about being afraid of getting COVID. He wrote it very quickly, right at the beginning when the pandemic started in Italy, and he started seeing a lot of people staying at home and all the social distance measures that the Italian government had. He wrote about also the political effects of it, of authoritarian governments saying, stay at home, like it happened in China. No? And he wrote about the anxiety and fears that he had about getting COVID. What have you seen about this? There are other authors, Sadie Smith also wrote about reflections during the pandemic. Zizek wrote about the pandemic as well. You wrote several pieces. Are you putting together a book?
Oh, I don't know. Actually, at least two of the pieces were already published in my last essay book, so they're there. But I think, what in my seminar for the psychiatrists, what I'm trying to do, I think, is really broaden our understanding of illness beyond what they call the biomedical model, right? That we start thinking about all of the forces that create illness and how inequality in itself is something that can induce illness. And I was going to say, you know, that people who live with racism, there are now studies of how that harms, you know, health, various organs, various systems of the body. So if even in part of the culture, even in, say, part of the science culture, people begin to reflect on why the responses to COVID were so different depending on where you were in the social hierarchy, that would be a very good thing. And I think there are scientists who are beginning to reflect on that.
Totally. Also, the differentiation that the pandemic has done is the New York Times has published a few articles about it on how if you go to a restaurant, if you go to an hotel, the people who work there are still wearing face masks, but the clients are not.
Yes.
And this also produces kind of a division of why is he still wearing that and I'm not wearing it. So what do you think about it?
Well, I think, you know, if you're in close contact in your daily life, if you're working in a grocery store and people are coming in and out, I mean, I actually always do wear a mask in New York still when I go into a grocery store or a shop. And you're absolutely right. Actually, the mask business is establishing a kind of social hierarchy of people who are more vulnerable. Therefore, they're wearing masks all day. And other people who are, well, I don't know, not as at high risk because they're just entering the store for a few minutes. So there is another legacy of the pandemic that we might want to think about.
That maybe it's here to stay as well. A few organizations in Mexico, there's an LGBT organization called YAG, and they published a study of how the pandemic affected mental health among LGBT people, and especially among trans people. And they found out that during the pandemic, there's a hotline where you can call and say, I'm gay, or I'm trans, and I'm in a very adverse situation. But during the pandemic, it exploded. A lot of people talked about suicide. A lot of people talked about feeling lonely. And a lot of people talked about wanting to go out again and to the world, or others staying at home and not seeing anybody at all. What have you found about it? Because you also write a lot about human beings being social animals.
Yes.
They need to be together. They need to come together.
Right. So, I mean, this is, you know, sort of the bottom line, right? We're social animals. And remember this too. We're all born out of the body of another person, right? We all gestate inside another person for 9 months. That's part of our trajectory. A kind of closeness, to say the least, and we're cut away from that person. And what, you know, exists then? Well, the social space, right, after birth. And without others, we don't develop, right? And human beings are, there's a word, it's called neoteny, which means that we're born early, and we retain juvenile characteristics for a very long time. That includes mental characteristics. We're not lizards, right? Lizards are born, they walk around, they leave their parents, it's just fine. But we're not lizards. We need a whole year after leaving, you know, the uterus. And there was a 19th century German physician who called the first year of life the extrauterine year, because you're carrying around the infant, can't walk, right? Anyone who's had babies, been close to babies, knows how dependent they are. Well, that dependence changes, but it never ends. And I think if we start thinking about the body as not just an isolate, but thinking about the body always in terms of others and other, right? How would we have language? You know, that first year of life, it's all about attunements between the parents and children, a kind of pre-linguistic music that's part of our lives. So yes, I'm trying to like shift foci. That's my job, and I do it with scientists too. I'm trying to create much more of a moving target instead of this obsessive categorization that's limited to a single isolated idea of a human being.
Sure. We're running out of time, but
Yes.
I wanted to we also want to open the floor for questions for Siri. But I wanted to ask you just one last question.
Yes.
How do you see this world in the post-pandemic world? This widespread use of social media, of people talking about their own mental health issues, candidly, openly, honestly. A lot of young people are using Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and saying, hey, let's shift the conversation to this. We need to talk about this.
Right. Well, listen, I think this is a good thing. I think it reduces stigma. I think openness about vulnerability is really important. And actually, it's not just a sign of courage. I think it's a sign of strength, right? We have a tendency to get so nervous about, you know, perceived weakness. But every human being has weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Everyone has been sick at one time or another, even if we're basically healthy. And I think this kind of conversation, and you know, as they say, sharing, isn't that the word, is mostly very helpful, and especially about mental health and psychiatric illnesses that have very large stigmas attached to them. And you know, I feel that's, you know, part of my little role in all this is also to understand how the mind and the body are not two different things. They're completely, you can't reduce psychiatric illness to the brain because, as I was saying, it's also part of our social existence. But it's really important that we try to combat that stigma.
Thank you for doing that. Let's open the floor for questions. If anybody wants to ask Siri,
I have my translator.
she has a translator, so
Yes.
you can be in Spanish first.
Yeah.
Thank you. And
Thank you.
te traen un micrófono. A ver. No, no se escucha. No, we can hear you. No te podemos oír. Si quieres, dale uno de estos.
Bueno, quería preguntarte, Siri, acerca de, ahora que trajeron a colación a Zizek, quería saber qué opinas del libro Sopa de Wuhan, que se escribió al inicio de la pandemia y que fue una recopilación de, pues, filosofía respecto a la pandemia, pero era una cuestión muy interesante porque apenas se estaba comenzando. Entonces, por ejemplo, Zizek mencionó que era la caída del capitalismo, me acuerdo que mencionó algo similar, y otros decían que era como un ensayo de sometimiento al pueblo, ¿no? De mantenerlos a todos en sus casas, esta cuestión. Entonces, muchos académicos lo consideraron como una premura. ¿Qué opinas de este ensayo en particular, que aparte fue criticado por ser racista, por ponerle sopa de Wuhan? Eso.
Yeah. Right. Well, I haven't read it, so that puts me off. But I do know Zizek's work, and I think, let me put this in. I have admiration certainly for certain parts of what he does, but I do think he has a tendency to get ahead of himself. I do. And nevertheless, the philosophy. Okay, so Wuhan soup, it started in Wuhan. So there's probably an argument to be made, obviously, that there was no intention of racism. And perhaps it was Donald Trump who helped us to the racist part of this, right, by calling it the China flu. But philosophy about this issue, I think, is really important. And one of, what I've been interested in is that, the idea of the isolated patient that's treated alone, right? This model is a neoliberal model, right? That it's the me, right? So since the 70s, especially in the United States, but elsewhere as well, this idea of, the lonely genetic patient and that you just treat yourself and everything's going to be fine is obviously a useless idea in a pandemic. Right? If one thing a pandemic shows us is that it's a small world and we're all vulnerable, and some people are more vulnerable than others. And that is a political issue. And I think it points to neoliberalism and its emphasis on the lone consumer, even when it comes to mental health and illness, right? You fix yourself, and then the world is great. But that's not going to work in public health. Yes. Spanish? There, take this.
No, I'm actually going to say it in
You're going
English.
to do it in English? Okay,
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Being a part of the LGBTQ community and also having mental illness problems, what can you do to try to become a better person? Like, what can you do? Like, what's the type of advice that you are willing to give me or give us or whatever?
Maybe becoming a better person is is the striving of all of us, right? And I think this is really a self-other question, right? Is that it's what are our relations with others? And part of those relations are also protecting the self, right? I mean, it's not gonna do you any good in your relations with others if you don't care about yourself. I mean, with the psychiatrists, I talk about this all the time. What are the degrees of empathy, right? If you need enough empathy to be understanding of the other. But if you're suffering as much as they're suffering, you're not going to be such a big help, right? You'll just be a pool on the floor. And for physicians, that's quite important. You have to strike some kind of balance of self-protection and empathy. And, okay, my thing, I've been thinking about this a lot. Forms of humility about what we know have helped me a lot, right? Anytime someone imagines that, he, she, or they owns the truth, I think we're in trouble, right? Life is a process. It's not a thing. We don't reach happiness. We're happy, we're sad, we're in between. And it's an ongoing process of understanding oneself, but always through others as well. God, life advice. It's a big burden.
Hello, you said something that
Yeah, it's in English.
New York was seriously affected with the pandemic, yes?
And so my question is, how that changed the New Yorkers' mindset? What changed after that?
You know, one thing I thought a lot about while it was happening. I mean, I'm 67 years old. I'm married, so I wasn't alone. But I thought a lot about young people, especially adolescents. You know, losing 2 years of your life when you're 14, 15, 16, or 17, the time when your social existence is so important, when you're exploring your erotic self, and suddenly you're prohibited from you know, being with others. And you're either stuck home with your parents, or, you know, if you have your own apartment, say you're in your 20s, you're alone. And that deprivation, I think, will have effects on people, you know, going on. Also, there can be something comforting about hiding. You know, there's some people, if they have, you know, some social anxiety, the pandemic prevented people from having to face the realities of social existence, and the desire to hide can become greater, which is not a healthy thing. So young people, and then of course there are children who couldn't go to daycare and, you know, walked outside, and all human beings had half their faces covered. Nobody knows what that means for childhood yet. So we'll see. There's someone in the back. There, she's there. Oh yes, we need that.
Hi, Siri.
Hi.
¿Puedes hacer la pregunta en español?
Yes, of course. Hang on. I'm just gonna get my. Okay.
Tú hace un tiempo atrás escribiste un texto sobre el tema del fallo de la Corte, sobre el tema del aborto en Estados Unidos. Mi pregunta tiene que ver cómo percibes tú este fallo, también en términos generales a los derechos reproductivos sexuales de las mujeres, tanto en el mundo, y también en particular cómo se vincularía con ese auge que ha tenido la extrema derecha, tanto en el Cono Sur como también en Europa. Me preguntarte eso. Gracias.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a big question. I was actually in the south of France on vacation when that ruling came down, and I was so distressed and so angry that I just sat down and wrote this essay. This is, you know, a human rights issue. There you are. It's a human rights issue. You know, I mean, I've been thinking of this slogan, you know, keep the state out of my uterus. And, you know, that's, to me, more powerful than, you know, my body, my choice. It's really saying the state cannot legislate inside really any body like that. And it also, I'm probably one of the only people who's really written about the biology of this, right? So this ruling means it's a very Catholic ruling. We know the Supreme Court now is ruled by Catholics. And it's the idea that a diploid cell, the zygote, you know, the very first fertilized cell, is a soul. So it's also the imposition of Catholic teaching. And just for everybody's knowledge, even in Catholicism, they dithered back and forth until 1869, when the fertilized cell was declared a soul. So this has always been an issue of moral contention, up for debate and for our court to decide. It's also, of course, very against anyone who can get pregnant, but of course, especially women, and especially fertile women, which is the first, almost always one of the early movements of authoritarian governments is to begin to restrict female reproduction. And we should see it as that, as a sign of growing authoritarianism. It happened, the Nazis, Mussolini's Italy, Franco's Spain. We're seeing it with Orban now. This movement to control reproduction, the ugly history of eugenics, it's very, very worrying. And I hope that everywhere, you know, people who think this is wrong will push back hard. Anyone else?
Well, thank you very much for being here in Monterrey, this great city. I'm glad to be with us. Well, my question is, you say about it to write should be good, like a good therapy, or to help nervous, or to help human immune system. That should be help. But how we can encourage our children, teenagers, even adults to read, to write.
Oh, to write.
Yeah, to write.
Well, it's good to start them reading first. It starts them reading.
But to help our children, because right now everybody is busy with multimedia, technology.
Reading with what?
Social media.
It's so much noise. I'm sorry. It's not you. We have a lot of competition.
Well, for instance, to people to be busy to writing short story or anything anyway, is busy with social media or television or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah. So you're talking about children writing and how to encourage them to write?
Right.
Yes, that's it. Okay. So, that's right. I mean, make it fun, right? I mean, if you tell any child, give them a notebook and say, write, they're going to resist. But I think children, especially if they're encouraged to tell stories, want to, and when they can write those stories, even very, very short ones, it's fun. And when they know they have a reader in their own family, that exchange, I think, is really a good thing. So they start by telling stories, and then making a little book is a lot of fun. Okay, we did it. Thank you.
Agradecemos a nuestros invitados a nombre del Tecnológico de Monterrey por su valiosa participación. Gracias también a todos los asistentes por su presencia. Los invitamos a que continúen disfrutando los eventos del programa cultural de la 30ª Feria Internacional del Libro Monterrey 2022. Que tengan ustedes muy buenas noches.